All right, so let's get to my favorite topic, which is Abel to Zechariah.
Abel to Zechariah, mine too. That's become one of my favorites.
So I was taking some notes on what Trent Horn was saying.
Yeah.
And if he had watched my videos, he would know some of these were already bad. He mentions that the scrolls, it's an anachronistic just to briefly go over the Abel to Zechariah, you want to just set up what the argument is for people who aren't familiar with it.
Sure, and then you go into yours, and then I'll go into mine. Yeah. Sure. So basically, in Matthew chapter 23 and Luke 11, Jesus talks about the blood of all of the prophets from the foundation of the earth, from Abel to Zechariah, it will be accounted on your generation. And in Matthew 23, he specifically refers to Zechariah as the son of Berechiah. Now, Catholic apologists think that this may actually be referring to the prophet Zechariah, which we call the son of Iddo, just to differentiate the two different Zechariahs. And it's not referring to the son of Jehoiada, that's in 2 Chronicles. And I brought up to him about the name conflation argument that you and I talked about, and Beckwith mentions in his book, but without going into the reasons why it's pretty obvious that Jesus is talking about the son of Jehoiada. Even the New American Bible, which again is a Catholic translation, and the New Catholic version, which is actually older, actually cross-reference the son of Berechiah to 2 Chronicles. So even they are saying that this is the son of Jehoiada, not the son of Iddo.
Yeah, the other thing is that secular scholarship, I mentioned an article from a Mormon source at BYU. You could listen to Tovia Singer, who is a Jewish anti-missionary. I'm going to react to one of his Abel to Zechariah videos soon. Everybody knows this is pointing to the Zechariah of everybody in the secular world. I don't want to say knows, because a lot of people on our side, even in the Protestant world, aren't really too familiar with this. They're familiar. They believe it's the Zechariah of 2 Chronicles, and I believe they are correct. And there's a reason for this, is that the information corresponds to what we know from the Talmud and other sources and from 2 Chronicles, where we have a positive identification. Now, the Hebrew name conflation thing, I just ask people to look up the preface to Psalm 34, where that, for me, was the eye-opener on this argument years ago, where instead of the Philistine king, they mention, Abimelech or something?
Abimelech. Yeah.
From the Genesis days when Abraham was in sojourning in Canaan. And it's a rabbinic practice. They did make an interesting point about Judith, which we could go into later about inerrancy, but I'll just mention it now. Well, actually, let's mention it when we get into the inerrancy thing, because something came to me last night why that wouldn't work. But so just to talk about the name conflation, just to describe this to people. So it was rabbinic practice. It didn't happen all the time, and sometimes, maybe hard to figure out, is that if you have two people with similar characteristics, maybe they're name characteristics, maybe they're people of a certain type, like, Abimelech and whatever the other guy's name was. They both start with A or Aleph or something. And
King both began with A.
Yeah, and they're both kings both kings in the same area. So it doesn't have to have a similar name, but so they conflate the names on purpose, not they don't disambiguate. They conflate on purpose. So when Jesus is saying, Zechariah ben Jehoiada, or no, Ben Berechiah, Ben Iddo.
Right.
This actually, you see this in the Targum to Lamentations, where they identify the Berechiah Benito, and they're swapping out the name. They're conflating the name on purpose.
Yeah.
So that's something I don't think they know. So about the scrolls, one thing that Beckwith mentions, and other people mention, is like, so Trent Horn was trying to say that it was mentioning about the scrolls is anachronistic. In other words, you can't have a canon unless you have like a book with a binding with a table of contents.
Yeah.
And then like this is also pertinent to the argument with the canon order from Genesis to Second Chronicles. But there's a Bariata. I might be pronouncing that wrong, but basically like a very ancient tradition that didn't make it into the Mishnah. That it does Genesis to Second Chronicles, so that would cover his argument. There wasn't like a listing ending in Second Chronicles until the 10th century. No, we have the really early, second, third century listing. But it has a canon list before there's before things were in bindings and were just on scrolls, which negates that whole anachronistic argument.
Right, and there's two things. Gary Machuda had said that the earliest list doesn't have Second Chronicles at the end, and as I brought up in the debate, that Beretta does, which goes back to like at the earliest, like the 2nd century. But we also have to understand this Beretta which is actually a tradition, isn't something that originated in the 2nd century. This is when it had been written down, but it was a tradition that had gone back way before that.
Yeah, and so the scrolls in the medieval period, which they want to point to as, this is the first time you're seeing Second Chronicles at the end. Well, I mean, if you ignore the, let me see if I'm going to try to share my screen.
Okay.
Let me screen share. Let me see if I get it up. So this is if you can see this, the Bariata or how do you pronounce that? Right here, it says the sequence of the prophets is, and then it lists it, right? And then that of the Hagiographa, which is the writings, it goes Ruth, Psalms, such and such, 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 Chronicles.
Yep.
And then it says who wrote these books. And the men of the great synagogues wrote Ezekiel, the 12 prophets, Daniel, blah, 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 blah. Ezra wrote the book of the genealogy, Chronicles down to himself. So this is a... so it's saying the sequence is this. These are the things. And this is a listing before the medieval time. But even if you want to... Let's scroll down to the... so that's... I forget. So that's an ancient ordering, right? Or so it's at least written down by, 200, 300 AD? So, but if you look at here, so then this is, I guess, the medieval scrolls. It's like Chronicles, 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 Ezra, Nehemiah, Ezra, Nehemiah, Ezra, Nehemiah, Chronicles, Chronicles. So they all end, at least in the time of Nehemiah, Chronicles being written by Ezra, Nehemiah. You don't see a lot of variation here. So, but they would say, it wasn't set until then. But that's just kind of ignoring this very important tradition up here. So... I'll link to this in the all right, I'll stop sharing my screen now, if I can do that. How do I stop sharing my screen?
and while you're doing that, another thing with the whole Ezra Nehemiah thing, those lists may be dealing with the books that were chronologically written later than Second Chronicles. But as Gary Machuda actually had mentioned in a recent video that he did, is that Second Chronicles may have actually been part of Ezra and Nehemiah at one time, which would explain why the Jews would say Second Chronicles was the last book. And because when you even read Ezra picks up on the last two verses of Second Chronicles. And even during the intertestamental period, that third Ezra that we had talked about, it doesn't just begin with the last two verses. It actually begins with the last two chapters of Chronicles. And so it actually has more information from Chronicles than it does even Nehemiah. Nehemiah, it only includes half of a chapter. So we have evidence from even outside of the Old Testament that this likely would have been part of, one basically large scroll.
Yeah, and to me, Okay, so I think we covered that pretty well. I think I do need to get to something, which I thought I could not even understand. Like, I listened to it live.
Yeah.
But then I was going back and looking through the transcript, and obviously the YouTube transcript timestamps weren't matching with the video exactly, so I couldn't get the audio. But based off of what I was reading in the transcripts, Trent Horn was arguing that Abel was not a prophet.
Yeah, that floored
even though Jesus is saying the blood of all the prophets, and then just happens to, like, okay, you need to talk about that, and then we also need to talk about if he's not marking beginning and end points, why is he starting with Abel?
Yeah.
Like, why start with Abel if you're not creating? I think they may have, at least Gary Machuda may have listened to me, because I mentioned the bookends thing in a video where I respond to Trent Horn.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure if Machuda did watch that video before making his, which I have yet to respond to his, so that's neither here nor there. But it's like, they are obviously bookends, because it's saying the blood of all, and this is important. You mentioned it. You have to use both Matthew and Luke.
Yeah.
Because we have synoptic gospels for a reason.
Right.
Right? God gave us multiple viewpoints of the same thing for a reason. You got the blood of all the prophets. So Abel's not a prophet according to Trent Horn.
According to Trent Horn, no, and that's why I brought up in the debate that maybe Trent Horn is thinking a prophet is someone like Isaiah, that performs miracles or predicts the future or has some type of
direct revelation.
Yeah, exactly. And I says that's not just what a prophet is. A prophet is somebody who is either speaking or even acting in a way that would have a direct revelation and speaking basically for God. For instance, the difference between Cain and Abel is that Abel was actually obeying God and doing what God was telling him to do. And that's one of the reasons that made him a prophet. Go ahead.
Well, the word can have language, and this is when we harmonize Paul and James. The word justified doesn't have quite the same meaning in both. Right. Well, the word prophet, it depends what context you're in. If you're in some contexts, I'm talking about like someone like Isaiah, but in other contexts, I'm also including people like Abel who testify to the truth, and this would also be pertinent to Zechariah, because Zechariah died in the temple. He was testifying to God. He wasn't necessarily got like a dream and vision and had a communicate.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And then the other thing that he asked me, he says, well, do you believe that non-prophets, meaning somebody other than like an Isaiah type prophet, can write scripture? Because he says, you believe that Ezra wrote scripture. I go, yeah, I do. He wasn't a prophet. He was a scribe. And he says, but he wasn't a prophet. I go, no, but he wrote during a time of active prophetic ministry. He wrote during the time of Zechariah and Haggai and Malachi. And
it'd be like Luke.
It would be like Luke, exactly. Yeah. And Trent has no problem with Luke, and even has no problem with Mark, even though there's nowhere in the New Testament that said that Mark had written prophetic scripture. But it was written during the time of miracle performing apostles, which was one of the criteria that I brought up several times during my debate. So I brought that up, so that kind of floored me.
Right. Just to interrupt you here, it's like a vouch, right? Like a New Testament document that the apostles weren't around to vouch for.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. No.
Like the Shepherd of Hermas.
Right. It's like you have to be tied to apostolic authority. So that there's a direct parallel where you have to, and they have to undercut this by. This is a whole other thread about the time of prophecy being ceased, or whatnot. Where and we, this is beyond my capabilities, but at least the sources I've seen is that say, and I mentioned this in a previous video, I think responding to I forget whom, but maybe it was the How to Be Christian kid.
Yeah.
Where Josephus was using prophet in kind of like a more in that previous the Spirit moved me to do wrote you to write a book, or more in a charismatic sense. So what they have to, and I'm going to go off on a rant here, and you can really see this in the Abel to Zechariah thing. And there's two main things I think they do in this Apocrypha debate. One is they try to, and especially with Abel to Zechariah, they can't identify who Zechariah is.
Mm-mm.
Okay, which again goes to the fallibility of at least the transmission of oral tradition.
But they can't identify who Abel is. Which is interesting.
Yeah, because he's in Scripture, right?
Yeah.
So they can't identify who Zechariah is. They can't tell you who it is, but they just want to kick up enough doubt, even though we have information to give a positive identification. Then the standard of proof becomes basically knowing things as God knows it. Where the standard of proof is like, I have all this, well, there could be a Zechariah that left no mark on history, even though like the Zechariah 2nd Chronicles matches this guy completely. We even have evidence of the Hebrew name conflation with him specifically. So it's not just like, oh, this is a possibility, but like we have that this is a rabbinic practice in the Targum of Lamentations. And it's like, and again, look at my video on Trent Horn with Abel to Zechariah. We go over this. It's just like kick up doubt, kick up doubt, kick up doubt.
Yeah, he even dies the same way, that he had died. And when you go back to Matthew chapter 21, when Jesus is setting all this up and he's talking about the parable of the landowner, he actually says that the Jews of the Old Testament had murdered the prophets and even stoned one. And what does it say in 2nd Chronicles? That not just that they killed him, but that they stoned him. That's how he died, and that he stoned him between the house of God and the altar, which is exactly how the Matthew and Luke describe how he died.
Well, this is why if you went to an atheist or to Tovia Singer or someone like this, the Catholic apologetics is really geared. They do like mere Christian sort of debates with atheists, but their apologetics are really geared towards talking to Protestants where we have shared assumptions. But if you start talking to someone outside the faith, this stuff's not going to fly. No. Right? Like if you start talking to Tovia Singer and like, well, it's a Zechariah no one heard of. It's like that's not gonna, that's not gonna work. Or I guess that's more for Machuda or something like that. But again, so their strategy is just kick up doubt, kick up doubt, kick up doubt, and then Rome comes riding in as a white knight, to save you from all this uncertainty from the doubt they kicked up. So they make common cause with skeptics, and this will segue into our infallibility thing. But
another thing too is Matthew in particular, unlike Luke, was writing to a Jewish audience. Right. So just as Jesus expected the Pharisees and his Jewish audience to know who this Zechariah is, just like he expected them to know, which, as you correctly stated, is from Scripture, specifically the first book of the Old Testament. Matthew and Jesus expected their Jewish listeners and readers to also know who this Zechariah was. And Rome is saying, well, we know who Abel was, but we don't know who this Zechariah is, even though we are the same church as from the first century who did know. And when I brought this up in my debate, Trent says, well, we don't necessarily have the same resources, that they had in the first century. I mean, it was kind of an out on his part, but it's like, actually, yes, you do. You have the Scriptures, and the Jewish readers and listeners had the Scriptures, and that's how Jesus and Matthew held them accountable.
Well, this gets to I thought you were supposed to be led into all truth. I thought that was the blank check that allows you to define something 1,800 years later and then get out for each card. I'm not sure if it's so much pertinent here, but I'll mention it here because I mentioned their one strategy. Their second strategy is to say where Sirach is mentioned as scripture by a few rabbis in the Talmud. And that's enough to say, oh, the canon's totally open. So it's kind of like how conspiracy theorists work, in my opinion, where there are always a set of facts, right, where history is messy. You're not going to get everybody to agree unless you start killing people. Okay? And then, so a few rabbis here and there who likes Sirach or Sirach or however it's pronounced.
Right.
But you have Josephus, you have Jubilees, you have the Abel to Zechariah, you have all these comments that in the main show what it was, but it would be like saying, oh, the New Testament was totally in chaos. Wasn't was totally in chaos because not to say they think the Old Testament was totally in chaos, but like everything was up in the air because a few people thought the Shepherd of Hermas was scripture. It's like, it's like you're the aberration kind of, to me, proves it's the exception that proves the rule. Right. But they want to make the exceptions like determinative of like, oh, everything's, and remember, they need everything to be uncertain, so you have to rely on them to figure stuff out. That's the main play. To them, like in Catholic apologetics, it's always about the church. It's not about the evidence. It's always about the church, and whatever gets us to trust the church is what they're going for. I think that's it. Yeah, for the Abel. Is there anything you wanted to add or riff off of that, or
no? Just to kind of piggyback on what you made the comment, I says, and this is why I mentioned in the debate, I says, well, if you're going to use that argument that you can find Jews in the Christian era as well as early Catholics, that believe that these individual books were scripture, and so therefore you have to include all of the Apocrypha. Then do you accept the Shepherd of Hermas as scripture because you have an early church father in the late 2nd century, Irenaeus, who quoted and specifically referred to it as scripture? And Trent Horn's response was, well, this wasn't in the Fourth Council. So they switched the argument. They moved the goalpost. And it's like,
it's not a consistent standard.
No, or was it, or wasn't in, this is the New Testament we're talking about. The Old Testament, it's like, well, they're both supposedly Old New Testament. They're both inspired scripture. I'm using the same standard as you are. And if you're going to go with the 4th century councils, well, then guess what? The 4th century councils also included 3rd Esdras, which wasn't early versions of the Septuagint. It was in printed copies of the Vulgate, and it was also affirmed by the Second Ecumenical Council of Nicaea, as well as the local councils of Hippo and Carthage. So they focus on individual arguments, but they don't see how their individual arguments conflate with one another.
How do they, getting back to consistency, how do they view like Abel to Zechariah not covering the canon, but Hebrews 11 is covering the canon?
I don't know, because like it says, they don't believe that it is referring to that, and they said that he's simply talking about characters during this time or martyrs, and Jesus is just randomly picking 2 martyrs specifically that God had invoked his wrath on. He invoked on his wrath by the blood that was spilled that's crying out from the ground, which is Abel, and the other one that he had wrath on was Zechariah. But if anything,
I saw Trent say like the beginning point was Abel because it was a private murder, and the Zechariah was because it was a public murder. And I was like, well, that still doesn't explain why you start with Abel, and doesn't explain why it represents the blood of all the prophets, and especially. I don't know. I'm just trying to look. I'm trying to look for consistency when it's not there.
And that argument still does not disprove that Jesus is not talking about or drawing from an already established canon.